growing up, I played baseball. But I'm not sure why I played baseball, because it was not what I would call a very enjoyable experience. I was a pitcher, and when I wasn't pitching, I played left field. And as a left fielder, my primary emotion was fear. Fear that the batter would hit the ball in my direction. I was scared to death that the ball would come flying toward me, and I would miss it or drop it, or generally make a fool out of myself. So I would stand in left field, praying that the batter would hit the ball to center, or right, or maybe ground out. But not to me, Lord. Oh, please, not to me. As a matter of fact, it was in left field that I first developed a prayer life. Unfortunately for our team, our center fielder was subject to the same fears and anguish. And one afternoon, a batter hit a towering fly ball to left center field. As the center fielder and I drifted together, I called out, "You take it, Ted." And he called back, "It's all yours, Jeff." And I said, "You called it, Ted." And he said, "No, I didn't. You called it for me." And I said, "Ted, I don't want it." And he said, "I don't want it either." And I said, "But it's coming to you, Ted." And he said, "No, it's not. It's coming to you." And as the ball started to rapidly descend upon us, I stepped back and shouted, "Ted, take it." And he held up his mitt and the ball dropped right into it. I said, "Hey, nice catch, Ted." Ted and the towering fly ball. That's what I remember about life in left field. Fear. But when I was pitching, I did not feel fear. My primary emotion as a pitcher was anger. You see, my father was the coach. Now, I love my father, but I don't think I loved him very much when I was pitching. You see, I was just too angry at him. It was my father who insisted I be a pitcher in the first place, and who taught me how to pitch. He was convinced that I could be a great pitcher, in particular, a great fastball pitcher. The fact that I had matured early and was nearly a foot taller than anyone else on my team in Little League might have had something to do with his estimate of my abilities. At any rate, on spring evenings, when I could have been off playing with my friends, I found myself instead in my backyard pitching to my father. My father had a theory about pitching. His theory was that a big windup and a complete follow-through would result in a blazing fastball. So he had me practice this huge windup, which I was to scrape my hands on the ground in front of me, then bring them way back behind me, rear back, and bring my pitching arm directly over my shoulder, and follow through by kicking my left leg out and bringing my left hand down parallel to my left and touching the ground with my hand. And again, we would practice it. Finally, I got the wind-up down pat. It was the follow-through I had trouble with. It just took so much energy and effort to follow through. And so my dad would shout, "Follow through, Jeff. You gotta follow through." And I would get so angry when he said it. However, his words and my anger did provide the necessary motivation for developing a blazing fastball. I figured that if I could throw it hard and fast enough, I could knock him right off his feet. And so it would go on those cool Minnesota spring evenings. Me pitching, my father catching, my father shouting, "Follow through, Jeff. You gotta follow through." Me muttering to myself, "I'll show you follow through." Winding up, throwing the ball as hard as I could, trying to put a hole through the catcher's mitt and my father's hand. Well, the result being, I became a pretty good fastball pitcher in Little League. But the next summer, I graduated to Babe Ruth League. And soon the other boys began to mature. And suddenly, I wasn't very tall anymore. And my career as a pitcher began to decline. And I will never forget the hot July evening when for all practical purposes, my pitching days and my father's coaching days came to an end. I was on the mound and struggling. It had not been a good night. Our team was losing, and I was hot and tired and just wanted it over. All night long, my father had been riding from the dugout. "Big wind-up now, Jeff, big wind-up," he would shout. And I would take a big wind-up. "Bear down out there, Jeff, bear down." Whew. And I would bear down. And then he would say, "Concentrate, concentrate." And I would concentrate. "Fire that pill," he would shout. "Fire that pill." And I would fire that pill. Inning after inning, I could feel the anger building within me. And then in the 6th or 7th inning, it happened. From the dugout, my father shouted, "Follow through, Jeff. You gotta follow through." And I did it. Suddenly, I just stopped, straightened up, and turned toward the dugout. Both my father and everyone in the stands knew what I was thinking. I was thinking of throwing the ball right at him. I was trying to decide if I should pitch it to the catcher or try to pick off my father in the dugout. But as I stood there trying to decide, it struck me that the dugout looked like a carnival shooting gallery with my father and the other coaches and players, the ducks. And as my father was moving nervously back and forth along the dugout wall, I thought that, if I led it just a little, I could nail it. And it seemed like forever that I stood there trying to decide. And finally, I did decide. Turned back to the face the catcher, threw an angry fastball, retired the side, and walked home stomping mad. I didn't play baseball the following season. My father did not coach a team. And the cool Minnesota spring evenings were no longer spent pitching in the backyard. And the hot July nights were no longer spent throwing fastballs on a dusty field. Instead, my father had me out in the backyard practicing blocking techniques in preparation for the upcoming football season. He thought I'd make a great blocking guard. And he had a theory about blocking. Good charge or windup, and then follow through. Follow through. And so for the next 5 years, I spent my fall afternoons and Friday evenings laboring on a football field, feeling this mixture of fear and anger, and yet gladness too, because at least I wasn't out in left field or on a pitching mound. And now and then, from high in the stands, I would hear a very familiar voice shout, "You gotta follow through, Jeff, you gotta follow through." And I suppose that like most things fathers say to their sons, that their sons do not like or want to hear, and that make them mad, it was true. I guess that's why sons get so mad at their fathers and don't want to hear what their fathers are saying, because what the father is saying is true. My father knew me well enough to know that all my life, my great battle would be just that, following through. I think he knew that I was always have a great windup. The question would be, would I follow through? And maybe that's the question for most all of us. Will we have follow-through? We might have a great windup. We might begin a project with great enthusiasm. We might set out to accomplish things with great excitement. We might sincerely promise to do this or that. But will we follow through? My father was right. Without following through, a great windup produces little or nothing. And it's certainly true when it comes to being a Christian. We can have a great windup. We can say all the right words. We can promise this and that. We can set off with excitement. But without follow-through, without following through with commitment and dedication, it all comes to nothing. Follow through, Jeff. You gotta follow through. It's just as true for being a Christian following Christ as it is for pitching or blocking. And that's exactly what Jesus was talking about in our gospel reading for today. Following through. You got to count the cost, he said, which was to say there is a cost. And if you don't count the cost, you won't be able to follow through. You won't finish the tower, win the war. And he said it to the multitudes who were tagging along after him, excited and enthused, promising to follow him anywhere. He said it to the crowds who had no idea that he was heading toward Jerusalem and the cross that surely awaited him there, who thought that Jesus was some kind of magician or something, and that to follow him could be quite a lark. And so Jesus stopped them and told them they'd best think about what they were doing, what was required to follow him. And what was required were new loyalties and commitments and priorities. That to serve him meant turning away from serving only their families in order to serve others, just as Jesus had turned away from his family to serve them. And it could very well require sacrificing their own wants and needs, he said, forgetting themselves, carrying a cross in order to help and heal others, just as willing as he was willing to forget himself and sacrifice himself for their sake. It meant no longer considering their possessions simply to be their own, that their time and abilities and money did not belong to them alone, that they would have to let go of themselves and give of themselves, just as he let go of himself and gave himself. You got to know the cost, Jesus was saying. You got to be willing to follow through, he was saying, or it will all come to nothing. Of course, it seems like a rather strange thing for Jesus to say, surprising, because Jesus was always holding up the all or nothing ones, the go for broke ones, the ones who didn't count the cost, as examples. It was the one talent guy who got it in the neck, the one who counted the cost of risking what he was given and decided the cost was too great. While the other ones who didn't count the cost were held up as shining examples of what it meant to follow or to have courage or faith. Love with abandon, Jesus always seemed to be saying. How many times shall I forgive? 7 times? Try 7 times 70. If a man forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. If he strikes you on the right cheek, offer him the left. And if he wants your corduroy jacket, give him your overcoat as well. If you love those who respond to you in love, so what? Love your enemies, even though you can count on nothing in return. If the wine at the wedding feast runs low, I'll drown them with more wine than they can possibly drink. Don't worry about the cost, Jesus always seemed to be saying. And now he's saying, count the cost. So what's going on here? Which way is it? Well, it's both. My dad was right, hard as it is for me to admit. You need both a great wind-up and great follow-through. We need passion and excitement and enthusiasm and the willingness to take risks and love with abandon. Yet we also need to count the cost, to know what it'll take so we can follow through. One without the other only leads to disaster. If we have excitement and enthusiasm and have no idea of the time and energy and devotion required, we end up starting a lot of things, finishing few, and possibly hurting many people. But if we only count the cost, have no excitement or passion, probably won't start anything because the cost will always be too high. It's kind of like having children. If you wait until you can afford them, you'll never have any. But if you don't consider the cost in terms of time and money and changes in lifestyle, you could harm them. But it's not just others who are helped or hurt. It was for their own sake too, Jesus told the crowds to count the cost, because when we're not able to follow through, we often end up feeling guilty and judge ourselves to be failures. And frankly, though there are times when the cost is too high, too much is against us, we can't follow through. We need to be honest about that, so we don't end up beating ourselves up, judging ourselves, thinking ourselves as failures. To count the cost enables us to follow through with joy and avoid the killing guilt and sense of failure. We need both, really. Great wind-up and follow-through. Now, which, I wonder, do we need to work around here? Well, I have a feeling if my father was in the congregation, what he'd be shouting out is, follow through. You gotta follow through. And I guess he'd be right. We're pretty good at a great windup. Always been great at dreaming, making plans, getting excited. Where we've always needed some work is on following through. And maybe we still do, committing ourselves and time, energy, resources to follow through in our dreams. Carry out our plans. Keep serving with joy and passion. Truth is, the cost is not too high. We can follow through if we so choose. And so, what I would recommend is something that as a 13-year-old on a hot Minnesota July evening, I thought I would never, ever recommend that we take my father's advice, work on our windup, keep working on dreaming and hoping and planning and loving with excitement, and work on our willingness to take risks, to go for broke. But more than anything, follow through. Follow through. Follow through with faith and commitment to the Christ who is our hope and salvation. Amen.